Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Mandel, and this is something that we are calling right now, for lack of a better name, the Not Podcast Podcast. So I would like to welcome Nick Carter to the Not Podcast Podcast. Is this your first Not Podcast, Nick?
Yeah, I think it is, but I'm looking forward to it. So,
Have you been on a podcast though?
we did one a while back for Data Center Hawk, back probably a few years ago, kind of covering the same sort of topics. So I was a little bumpy through it. Maybe I'll be a little bit more refined now, but I don't know. No guarantees.
Nice. All right. Well, that does bring us to our topic. We're going to talk about data centers, and we'll talk about property tax and the tax implications of data centers and what's going on in that market. It's a topic that's interesting to me on a personal level because before starting CompStack, I was a commercial real estate broker, and for a while I was doing office leasing, but then I kind of carved out a niche in data center brokerage, which I left brokerage in 2012, and doing data centers at that time, it was very much the Wild West. Still a burgeoning industry and still a very quickly changing industry, but it's one that is very interesting to me, and interesting from the perspective of, and we'll talk about this, I think, of how much it is real estate and how much it's not real estate as well. And so I'd love to dig into it a little bit, but Nick, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and who you are, what you do?
Yeah. So this is a topic that's kind of found its way to my purview simply because there is so much froth and activity in the data center sector right now. Myself, I work at Altus. We're marketed as an asset and fund intelligence company. We own Argus software. I think our main bread and butter is, at least our main identity is within real estate tech and real estate data services, similar to yourself. But the group that I'm within is the Real Property Tax Group, and the team that I lead is called the Case Management Team within Real Property Tax. And all that means is we'd like to think of ourselves as the central intelligence hub for real property tax. We sort of represent an embodiment of the offerings of Greater Altus Group, but we are able to deploy them within the U.S. tax practice. What that means is appraisal type of inputs, using data such as CompStack's data for use in developing presentations for assessors, specifically within property tax cases. But it's been doing appraisals probably for about 20 years now, almost 20 years. I started in San Francisco, since moved to Texas. I have an MAI and SRA designation with the Appraisal Institute. I have a designation with the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, some state certified general appraisal licenses, and I have a senior property tax consulting license in the state of Texas. So that all sort of aligns with where the focus of my practice is now, which is appraisal for primarily property tax cases. But a big part of that, as you're going to see, is trying to figure out what's going on in the data center market and try and get those types of clients the most relief we can on the property tax side, because there's a plague of overpayment in state and local taxes within the data center industry right now, simply because of the lack of understanding of the nuances in this property type.
Interesting. So before we get into that, why don't we just talk about what the sector is all about? Maybe explain to us, and I'm happy to chime in here and be helpful if I can, but what are data centers, what do they do, and why is it such a hot asset class right now?
That's an interesting one. I'm not even sure that data centers are a piece of real estate, right? Like there are examples of data centers. Microsoft has sunk a tube in the Pacific and called it a data center, right? As an experiment for natural cooling sources. They're kind of the capital sourcing topic du jour in all sectors of the commercial real estate. Now, the probably classic embodiment of a data center right now would be some sort of super secure, power accessible, network accessible facility that can provide sufficient power to meet the needs of today's applications. And the hot application of the day right now, as we're going to talk about, is artificial intelligence, which is an incredibly processing intensive application, right? It's certainly a very buzzworthy type of application, but it's one that consumes a ton of electricity. And the power consumption, kind of the limiting factor on what makes a data center in the first place. Anything can essentially be a data center. They used to be closets, I think, in the 1960s. And there's no secret as to why data centers all found their way to Northern Virginia. There was a great government infrastructure there, and in the 1960s, these massive rooms for servers that were very resource intensive, like they are today. But there is not even much of an agreement, I think, on the definition of exactly what is a data center. So we can give some great examples, but then, if we turn around in a few years, the embodiment, the design, the look is going to be considerably different than it is today.
Sure. Well, I think for people who are new to this industry, I think you could, if you've ever walked into one of these facilities, it's sort of like if you've walked into the IT room in your office. If you're in a decent sized office and there's a rack there with some switches and maybe some servers and some backup power supplies, it's sort of like that, but a lot more of them.
Oh yeah.
On steroids. It's so these are big facilities, and they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Filled with racks and racks of servers and other equipment that is there to serve as the backbone for what we think of largely as, quote, the cloud, right? The cloud.
Well, it's the internet. Yeah, it's essentially the internet. Man, that's what it is.
Yeah, the cloud is actually these big boxes that consume a ton of power and have great interconnectivity. You mentioned Northern Virginia. The other key, attribute to Northern Virginia is that it's there's access to the transatlantic fiber that comes there, right? And that's another thing I think people don't realize is that when you connect to someone between the United States and Europe, you're actually doing that via undersea cables that have been laid by boats that have cables on the ocean floor that go between North America and Europe. And one of the major points at which those cables come to the United States is in that Northern Virginia area.
Yeah, I've seen any of the videos of how they have to repair those cables too. Every once in a while, one will get broken, and it's a huge ordeal to go out there and pull the cables up and splice fiber, to get those things, up and running again. It's a tremendous undertaking.
I can only imagine, and I know that, companies like Google spend billions of dollars laying them. What I don't quite understand, I'd love to, learn about, and maybe is and it's a whole different conversation, but who exactly is paying for that? Where the money, where's the money? Obviously, it's in Google's interest for there to be internet, but it's serving, these cables ultimately are serving the whole world, and where the money comes from to pay for that, and how that all trades hands is something that'd be very interesting to understand.
It's very interesting, and there are some data center REITs that do provide cabling. I think American Tower is one of the services they provide. I don't know if it's the undersea cable, but they do provide cable infrastructure to service data centers, and the exact economics of that I'm not familiar with. But if we want to take this idea of this behemoth of a computer monster that's housed in real estate on steroids compared to what it used to look like, I mean, it doesn't really become an investable class of real estate. It doesn't become a core class of real estate until 1996, when the Telecommunications Act deregulated a lot of the telecommunication providers, and then you had companies like Comcast going out and there was competition amongst your service providers. So these data centers started to pop up, and that's kind of where the design and the third-party investment element came in, and that's kind of what brings it into where we are today, talking about commercial real estate. This is an investable class of real estate. There is a landlord position, right? And that came from a lot of the decisions and designs that came out in 1996. But before that, you're right. It was like a closet in your building. It was pretty much user sourced, user supported types of rooms, real estate, buildings that were in charge of maintaining these critical systems inside.
Yeah. Well, let's break this down a little bit, right? Because we're talking about this this infrastructure versus real estate value, and which pieces of value are tied to the physical infrastructure versus the equipment, and so for instance, obviously, as we talked about with access to things like transatlantic fiber, for instance, the location of the building matters. That's classic real estate. The box matters. It's got to have high ceilings. It's got to have the right footprint, perhaps, and column spacing. Access to power, I suppose, is a real estate attribute, sort of, but not fully, maybe. Yes, it is as it relates to location, but else is real estate related, or is that it? Is that it? We kind of tapped out on the real estate attributes, and everything else is not classically real estate anymore.
Well, so a data center as it exists today is designed by an engineer probably from MIT as far as like how it can best source. Main thing is power and ingestion and deference of the heat, right, from these facilities. So they're not thinking about that. They're not thinking about what's real estate, what's a piece of equipment, what's a piece of personal property, which is in its most classic sense, personal property is whatever is in a building, and if you took it upside down and shook it, it's whatever falls out, right? They're not thinking like that. But unfortunately, the second greatest operating expense for these facilities is real estate taxes. So there does have to be that discussion, as you said, what is real estate, what is considered infrastructure, and the answer to that is it depends, which is the great answer. It is up to the laws that are in place wherever you're operating, and the laws can be different and they're defined. And what can be considered personal property tax is defined. It's out there. It's not up for interpretation. The sense of classic real estate, like an office building, an industrial building, an apartment, the concept of permanence is kind of what derives real estate value, right? It's always going to be there. You have a lot. The land is the permanence. The building depreciates. The building wears down. The building doesn't provide the same economic benefit as it did when it was originally designed. So the land element, the site selection is incredibly fascinating in data centers because there's so much push right now for these edge facilities that have to find their place on not just a tangential location near a growing neighborhood or population base or user base. They have to find a place on a network, like on the internet. The concept of where is the location on the internet is a fascinating concept. It's one that I'm still trying to learn, and it has to do with network junctions. It has to do with possible spots on the network that could provide any sort of signal disruption, which manifests itself as latency, right? The loading circle. So end user performance is kind of the hot topic as far as the real estate is concerned right now in the data center market.
Interesting. And then, of course, there's the competing factor, which may not always compete, I suppose, around the cost of power too, right? Because you go to a market, probably like the Seattle market or Washington State. There's hydroelectric power, which is low cost, right? Or I think Facebook went to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which I think had cheap maybe coal power. You go to where there's affordable power, which may or may not intersect with where there's the best interconnectivity.
Right. And that is the case with Central Washington. It's not the ideal location for interconnectivity, but I would add Dallas-Fort Worth to that location because we were sitting on the Barnett Shale, which is a huge natural gas deposit that's here, right? And it's had a favorable impact on power sourcing within this specific market. But if we're to get into data center growth trends, the limiting factor is the amount of power, which is fascinating. That is limiting the growth of data centers. I mean, the chips are coming as fast as they can. I mean, NVIDIA is off to the races providing chips, and the consumers are getting what they need, or the users, the application providers are getting the chips that they need. But in order to get enough power to run through these chips, that's not available. It's not very affordable in the markets where it is available. So the Columbia River Valley in Washington source of very affordable power, simply because it's mostly hydroelectric generated, which also has fantastic environmental optics.
Right, of course.
Which is a big part of funding for this market. A lot of the investors, the private equity, the big sources of institutional capital have a values-based mandate, right? So the values-based mandate dictates that they think about things and they project these types of values when they're deploying capital. So that's all part of the discussion, but power versus connectivity kind of rat race is an interesting one right now. We're finding a lot of smaller deployments of smaller data centers, 1 to 2 megabytes, 1 to 2 megawatts throughout communities that are like edge data centers, and they don't have that same requirement. But if you have 400 to 500 megawatt data centers, it's a huge consideration as far as site selection is concerned.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. When I did data center work, I was actually in Manhattan, which is quite a unique market, for data centers. I did deals outside of New York as well, but it was all about connectivity, right? And New York has these, what are thought of as carrier hotels, but used to be thought of as telco hotels. And these are facilities that started off as the interconnection points for telephones and telegraph equipment. And all the copper came into them, and then eventually it became the fiber that came into them. So, buildings like 111 8th Avenue, which Google now owns 32 Avenue of the Americas, 60 Hudson Street, where a large percentage of the world's internet traffic interconnects in these buildings. And so, yeah, I mean, you may just, these telco providers and these internet providers that, as well as the major internet companies may just have, a server or a rack in these facilities just to interconnect with other people. They don't need to have a huge facility. They just need to be able to interconnect so they can get their data going between one interconnection point and another. It's pretty interesting.
Well, so that is something that I need to learn more about. When I was in San Francisco, there were similar buildings that were right on the fiber highway. I think it was down Brannan Street in the South of Market District. In Los Angeles, it's Wilshire. One of the things that I found interesting, I was reading a book. It's called Fortune's Formula, I think, about in control of data when you're gambling, and this is totally tangential. It's for gambling, it's for horse racing, it's for all sorts of things. But one of the applications that was the most interesting is there was a group of traders that wanted to have a location in Manhattan that was close enough to the exchange, but it was an intermediary location between the big brokerage houses and the exchange, so that they could get the signal before it got to the brokerage houses. And I'm probably butchering the story, but that location on the internet is incredibly impactful. And I think in urban markets such as New York, it's a very interesting type of concept, and it probably still carries just as much importance as it did back in the days when nobody knew how to do anything with it, when they were just
100%. Yeah, no, it's all, a lot of it is around the high frequency trading and getting getting your trade in the fastest possible. To get that arbitrage within, nanoseconds. And it's interesting, actually, when the New York Stock Exchange built a brand new data center facility in Mahwah, New Jersey, they built a meet me room in that facility specifically so that all the high frequency traders could connect and all be in the facility itself. And we're able to charge them an exorbitant amount of money to put a rack in this meet me room. They even went as far as coiling the same amount of wire between every rack and whatever computer does the trades, regardless of where the location of the rack was within the room.
Sounds like that takes away any advantage. I don't know.
So that nobody within that room had any advantage over anybody else within the room, but everybody had to be in the room to have the advantage. So basically, they would able to charge you a fortune to be in the room, but you lose the advantage if you're not in the room. It's just pretty phenomenal. Yeah.
Well, and again, the folks making these decisions of where to build these things out. I mean, this is MIT level stuff. This is not office building development. So practitioners that are in the world of office development, multifamily development, I mean, they're not thinking the same way as folks that are deciding where the ideal location is for a data.
Right. And to bring it back to your work, right? You're dealing with these disputes between the municipalities assessing the taxes and the building owners, right? If you think about the New York Stock Exchange here, how many billions of dollars they're bringing in from people trading in this facility, but they're trading in that facility not because of the inherent value of that facility, but because they're there, and because of the infrastructure they've built there. And they've got to fight that fight as it relates to how the taxes should be paid, and what's equipment and what is real.
And that's a very important and impactful conversation, and it's one that's impacting several cases that we work on. We're proud to say that we probably represent a majority of the the large public data center operators in the country, and we're able to commit resources on the valuation side, on the theory side, to helping solve and helping communicate some of these positions as to what should be considered real estate, what shouldn't be considered real estate. I mean, it's incredibly impactful to have a transaction that has a bunch of value components, let's call it personal property, intangible, access to conduit, and then a classic bricks and sticks building on top of a good lot, right? The conversation has to start, and it always starts with who's ever putting the assessment notice on the roll. And the assessor in a lot of jurisdictions just hasn't gained the understanding of these assets to give a correct value, which is a simple measure of an outcome of an experiment, right? It's an estimate of an outcome of experiment. I'm estimating what's going to happen when you put a sign in front of a building and list it for sale. What's the most likely price that you're going to obtain when it's exposed to the market. So for assessors to be able to make that decision as to what that's worth, they have to have an understanding of what the participants are doing. And the participants are incredibly sophisticated. And the assets are very meticulously designed and engineered, and sometimes very transferable to these properties. So it's a very important conversation to be having. And it's look at all the dollars that are flowing into this space. All those dollars from a capex perspective are going to end up on some sort of a tax roll in some rough measure. So that has to be solved by practitioners moving forward as to where those different assets fall and what the tax implications would be of where they are assessed in the first place.
So maybe you can't say, but what do you find are the markets where you think that data center operators and owners need the most help as it relates to tax appeals, due to the way that the assessors think about taxes and the way as compared to the way you might look at it?
Well, that's the curious thing about state and local taxes, right? Is that they are administered on a county level. They're not administered on a state level. Now, in the state of Washington, the counties are in charge of administering the taxes. However, they have resources available through the state that they can tap. So they have state appraisal resources that they're able to tap to come in and help them determine whatever these values are. So no real mystery what state is the most impacted by oscillations in tax expenses every cycle, and that's Texas. Texas is the state that I'm in. It's an annual reassessment state, a non-disclosure state. So when transactions occur, and you guys know this through CompStack, it's not on the public record. So that creates a very inefficient market in the sense that the information for comparable sales is not available. So how do you establish value when you can't look at comps? A lot of times they shoot high, right? And they kind of force your hand to show you the value in order to get a tax reduction in the first place. So Texas right now, it's a huge population growth area. There are fiber highways here that go down to Latin America, especially running through Dallas and Houston. It's a hot area for data center development, and each of the counties has a different way of doing it. And that's our job, is to go in and help work with the counties, figure out a way that makes sense from a basic valuation perspective, and try and get the most fair assessment on behalf of the clients, the taxpayers. And the variations of where we start and where we finish are tremendous, and that represents money that they can invest in growth in their business, in the first place. So Texas is probably number one. It always has been. California is it's a market that's, say, roughly the size of Canada, right? And California is its own country and all intents and purposes. But California has a law in place set by a Proposition 13. It's not a law; it's a statute that limits the growth in assessment. So the annual reassessment's less impactful than the assessment that's put on the property as of an event date, the event being a transaction or new construction. So just the volume of properties in California make it an interesting state to work in. But the tax environment there, you're not as exposed to annual assessment increases that you would be in other markets. And to that note, the impositions in some markets have driven investors to different markets, right? Some counties have such unpredictable assessment policies that developers they don't care if they're high or low, they care that they're predictable. They want to be able to underwrite with a degree of certainty that they can't when there's an annual reassessment with an unknown methodology.
Is it your impression that counties are trying to offset losses in some asset classes that have really been hurting in this environment by going after ones that are hot, like data centers, and trying to make up the lost tax income?
I don't know. It's a possibility. That's
Yeah.
that's a little bit speculative, but I will say this, that in markets where there aren't a lot of large and material commercial real estate assets, there is pressure to get it to get the right amount of tax out of these large taxpayers. If you're the only hospital in a small community and you've all of a sudden become taxable, there's incredible political pressure to get a robust stream of taxation coming from these taxpayers. And that's the nature of the beast, how it always has been. But it has to be treated fairly. It has to be transparent. And that's what we can help with, is we can help get the assessments valued in a way that's consistent from a methodological perspective, and fair and reasonable and done in a transparent way.
So you mentioned that California, and it's an interesting environment in California in that we've seen in the major markets like San Francisco and Los Angeles properties that kept appreciating and appreciating and appreciating, right? And the proposition making it such that the taxes weren't reassessed very often, and so there probably weren't a lot of tax appeals because everyone acknowledged that the properties weren't being reassessed very often, and the values kept going up. Now things are changing. How does that
100%.
impact the world that you live in?
Well, everybody in California that's listening to this needs to depart from the notion that tax appeals are not a viable approach to saving money on your operating expenses. There is a misconception that because Prop 13 caps all annual growth to 2% a year, that in any market with 10 to 15 to 20% annual growth, there is never going to be an opportunity. That changes in moments, in times of distress, right? In times after, let's look throughout history. After the dot-com boom in San Francisco, huge value declines that needed to be captured through appeal if they weren't noticed at a lower value on the assessor's side from the initial notice that was sent out. So Prop 13 caps a lot of these value increases. That's a known fact. But when the value is decreasing below a certain threshold after the base year is set, there's a table that I've put together to share with clients, and it's if you bought the property this date, it's appreciated at 10%. The taxes have appreciated at 2%, but then you have a moment in time where there's a loss of 30%. Where do you get to the in the money value, the in the money amount where the assessment appeal is going to produce a reduction, right? in San Francisco and Los Angeles and any office market in California right now, if it was purchased in the past 5 years at least, we hope that folks are going to be looking at their annual reassessments and considering filing an appeal. In other words, the total assets of a hotel transact, that's the price that you see on CompStack, on whatever source there is.
Sure.
But the assets that are eligible for real property taxation are only the bricks and sticks, right? They're only the building and the land. Anytime that occurs, it needs to be looked at. You know, there is the opportunity for a viable appeal in California under those circumstances.
Pivot back to data centers for a minute. Where do you think we are in this market cycle? I mean, I can tell you that we're experiencing an environment in which our clients are constantly asking us for data for what would have been considered more niche asset classes. And in some cases, it's industrial outdoor storage or cold storage, which is also actually probably shares a lot in common with data centers as it relates to equipment and things like that. And some of it's, student housing and single family rentals and all sorts of things. But the number one request it seems we're getting these days is data center data. And we're getting it from all sorts of clients, major institutional players, real estate players that seemingly should not be experts in data centers. Are we overhyped here? Where are we in this cycle? Are we going to see, a come to Jesus moment here in this market, or is it just going to keep getting hotter?
I don't know. It's what happens if NVIDIA chip that comes out provides the same performance with half the power. That would be catastrophic for the data center market in all likelihood, because the power requirements would be lesser, right? So right. The market has higher than typical exposure to technological disruptions, right? From an engineering standpoint on these processors. Now, the demand for data, all indications are putting it in an exponential curve. The demand for data is going to go up, 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 up. If we start adopting blockchain currencies, those are incredibly processor intensive from a mining perspective, right? And there are a lot of markets that do mining of Bitcoin, for example, of any of these cryptocurrencies that are blockchain based. The mining costs from a power perspective are tremendous. So that will increase the demand for data centers. AI is going to increase the demand for data centers. What's the most interesting thing about this industry, if you look at just the supply across the board in the US and overseas, last year it grew about 25%. But the limiting factor is not the need for data centers. The limiting factor is the power.
Yeah.
Just last week, Microsoft announced that, and talk about environmental optics. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, 3 Mile Island.
Microsoft decided they're going to go in and dust off 3 Mile Island, for only data center use. So they're not thinking about buying the real estate, buying the data centers. I mean, they are making those decisions, but the big decision, the big strategy play right now is getting access to that power, which is fascinating. I mean, public response in Pennsylvania to putting 3 Mile Island back online to support the internet will be interesting to follow. I mean, it's still so new that I don't think they've crafted their decisions yet, but that's the game. That's the game right now. There is, what I understand from CBRE reports alone, that there is a limiting factor for the growth in this property type is in the power. There's just not enough power to grow the base of data centers to what would be supported by demand in the marketplace.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very interesting. I always get a little scared when I see people who don't understand an asset class, investing in it, right? When you start seeing, what was the adage of, somebody said, when the guy who shines my shoes tells me what stocks to pick, I know that there's a bubble, and not to say that our clients are the people who shine your shoes, but our clients are not data center experts, they're real estate experts.
Yeah.
And yet they're all going headfirst into data centers, and they're doing it with partners. These partners tend to be much more risk tolerant than they are. So they are maybe unintentionally taking on a lot more risk than a real estate investor typically would. And I've even heard, you know, commentary from one of our clients that they're hearing people say, you know, I think we should keep this space unleased, this data center space unleased. It's worth more to us empty than it is filled because we'll be able to lease it later for that much more than the time that it was empty if we just wait longer. I mean,
That's
that's crazy. That smells like a bubble when you hear that kind of thing, you know?
that's office space in San Francisco during the dot-com bubble. That was, you had during the dot-com period. I remember when I started doing appraisals in San Francisco, it was a buzzword. This is a dot-com lease. This is a company that wanted to warehouse this office space to protect themselves from those 20 to 30% annual increases, that would price them out of future growth at a market lease rate. So it's not a new thing. I don't think that much of this is that new or that there's always going to be froth and excitement in markets, right? And whether or not there's more froth than is demanded by the needs of current critical systems and servers and applications, I just don't know, and I'd be interested to find out. But there are some actual physical restraints on data center expansion right now. One being the power,
Yeah.
and so it's interesting to see, and investors love limitations on supply.
Right.
They love that. So
To your point on, you know, Bitcoin mining, and I can only hope that as it becomes harder and harder now to mine new Bitcoin successfully, that'll slow down. I mean, talk about just like a waste of resources and harm to the environment for no benefit to civilization. I mean, it's literally just, you know, fuel burning, power burning, facilities wasted just to create a currency. It's just wild. And also, I mean, I think many people may not realize this, but like, those facilities leverage GPUs, the same kind of facilities, the same kind of equipment that's used for AI is what's used for, mining crypto. But one does something very compelling and valuable, I think, potentially dangerous for humanity, but also very valuable for humanity, whereas the other one just seems to do something, relatively useless.
well, it's
But
powerful. It could be powerful good, it could be powerful bad, but it's certainly
yes,
powerful.
yes.
No, that's interesting about the and you bring up a great point. What's the carbon footprint of a Bitcoin? I mean, I don't know if that's being readily discussed. I mean, it's an incredibly compelling technology though for a fiat currency to be blockchain based. That's an interesting thing. But the mining of a Bitcoin now is you stretch the algorithm out. Not that it's let's say hard. It's that it's very diesel intensive. I mean, you got to run a huge amount of computing resources just to mine an additional coin on the chain, right? And therein lies the limit of my understanding of Bitcoin. But I have seen the facilities that mine them, and I have seen the smokestacks that are right behind them, fueling the electricity to these absolute power thirsty behemoths.
Do you have brilliance for us here to take away on what we should all learn from this, on how to move things forward in the data center world, and how can people who are listening best leverage the knowledge they've gained here to move forward?
There is such growth in this asset class. It's very complex that there are two sort of applications of appraisal, let's call it. There's the voluntary application, which is, let's say I want to go get a loan, right? And then there's the involuntary, the imposition application, which is property taxes. The assessors have to value your property every single year. It's their mandate. Now, if the market's growing faster than the rate at which they can gain competency, I encourage everybody to partner with some sort of a tax provider, or at the very least, take a critical lens to your assessment notices if you're within this space, within the data center space, because there are decisions that can be made and responses that can be made, appeals that can be filed that can correct the record and ensure that your taxes are applied in a fair manner. So I am a tax practitioner, so my message is coming from the tax side. Very important to take this very seriously, um, and and uh, and have someone that is competent in this space at least review your notice, ensure that everything's been categorized and addressed properly, and for those in California that are undergoing a decline in some values, same thing goes to you. Don't take your assessments lightly. It's an important and a very impactful number because it does result in your largest operating expense for the core classes of commercial real estate, which is property taxes.
Yeah.
So I just challenge everybody to take a very active approach in reviewing and thinking about their annual assessment notices.
Well, I think that's a great takeaway. There's no reason to leave money on the
It,
table or give money away. They could be in your pocket. So
and if you need help, I have to make one plug. A colleague of mine, well, not really a colleague, he's a mentor of mine, David Lenhoff and myself, just as of last month, were able to get a journal piece, an article published in the appraisal journal, published by the Appraisal Institute, which confers the MAI designation. David Lenhoff's a very well known industry participant. He's probably taught some sort of course to most MAIs in practice today, and was nice enough to work with me on this article. But it's published. It's called "Where's the Real Estate: Redundancies, Servers, Edge Sites, and the Search for Real Property's Role in the Modern Data Center," and that's in the Appraisal Journal, published by the Appraisal Institute, and it does address some of these issues as far as allocation and valuation and all sorts of things that would be impactful to all sorts of types of appraisal practice, not just taxation, but anybody who's doing an appraisal of a data center, I think, needs to at least give this a look, and it may find some helpful points in it.
awesome. Well, I think we'll have to make sure that we link that when we share this not podcast. So thank you for joining me. This has been fun.